So now we'd like to take some of the concepts we've learned, like PHP, and introduce that to using mySQL. So first let's just take a little, let's just describe what we're doing when we're creating a database using mySQL. And I'm using this as, I'm using Excel just as a way of describing, giving an example of how we can store data about people. So let's say, since we're going to be building a website for, you know, a hurricane, a town, how to handle, get information around about a hurricane after Sandy just hit the Jersey Shore. We're going to do a really simple example of where to store data into. So for example, let's say we wanted to have a table called people. Well, what we might do is we might have a column called first for the first name, last for the last name, email for their email address, and then maybe a password. And maybe this is the whole database, one table. And we need to be able to ask questions to the database like, for this particular email address, what is the password? So we have to somehow know how to ask these questions. Another type of database design would be this second one down here, this one in blue. And I'm doing this just not, there's no real logical reason for doing this, but we might want to have one table that has the first name, the last name, the email address, and that's it. And then we'd have a column for like a people ID, a PID, which would have like some numerical number, something that doesn't take up a lot of space. What we could then do is tie the data in this table to another table. And let's say we had a table called passwords. And the passwords table would say, well, for the people ID, let's say number 1, which refers to this person, their password is this, GTL, right? Jim Dan 1, if you watched that show. And then this might be a way of capturing the same exact data that's being captured up here. So just two different ways to do it. Now, if we wanted to add a new person to either one of these tables, if you wanted to add a new person to this database schema, we would type in the first name, the last name, the email address, and the password right here and hit enter. And one other thing we want to do is we want to set up the database in such a way that it keeps generating a unique identifier for each person. That way, if we need to tie any information about these people to some other table, we use this unique number. If you wanted to add a new person to this second schema, you'd have to take, the input is going to be the person's first name, last name, email, and password. You would have to first put the first name, the last name, and the email address in this table, enter it, which would then cause the database to generate a number here, then take this number, whatever that is, and then run over to this table and put that number here and then that password. So that's how I'm just demonstrating using Excel, and I'm demonstrating how we would record data into two different database schemas that actually capture the same data. So now, if we wanted to, from the internet, if we wanted to have a web page, take data and write it into a database, here's one of a few ways we could do it, but this is a pretty common one. So here you are, and you're connecting to the internet, so you send a message through the internet. Here's step 1. You're sending a message through the internet, and you're finding a web server. So a web server is a computer that's connected to the internet that is programmed to serve up web pages for anybody looking for them. So when you type in www.facebook.com, you're sending that message through the internet, and it's finding the Facebook server, and then a web page is coming back to you. So step 2 is a web page comes back to you and you see the web page. If it happens to be a web page that has a form on it, a place where you could enter data, like you can type in your email address and your password and then hit a button, and the button says log in, you would hit that button and it would send the data somewhere. But let's keep it simple. Let's just say it's some data that you're typing in and you want this data to be saved somewhere in a database. So step 3 would be, step 1 is you ask for the web page comes back, it has a form on it. Now you fill in the data and you hit a button. that button on your web page sends your answers to, let's say, a different web page, a web page that maybe you'll never see. But what this web page does is it accepts the answers, and then it wants to store the answers into a database. So it can go, the database could be on the same machine as the web server, but it doesn't have to be. It could be on a on a database server somewhere else in the world. The web server could be in California, and the database server can be in Germany or something. It doesn't really matter. But this web page could go through the internet and connect to a database server. And then it has to speak to the SQL engine. It'll speak to it and tell it, like, I need you to store some information in this table and maybe some information in this table. And that's how we could, from a web page, write to tables in a database. So this thing would handle how it gets written to the correct table. And that's how that would be the schema for how we would do that over the internet. If we also wanted to read from a database, what we could do is it's very, very similar, same kind of setup, just the sequence is a little bit differently. We would send a message through the internet to read a web page. And let's say this web page has data on it from a database. So what would be an example you might use a lot? Let's say you went to the NFL, or football, you want to see what are the latest football scores. So you want to see a page that has the most up-to-date scores. So the people who work at the database would keep updating the tables constantly. They're watching the games and they're updating the tables with the scores. Then you go and get the page. You want to go out to the database and get the freshest scores. You don't want to have scores from 20 minutes ago. So you go out and you ask for a web page. Well, this web page has to connect to the database, gather up some data, build the web page, and send it back to you. So how does it do that? Step one, you ask for the page. Step two, there's code inside this page which tells it to go through the internet and log into the database server. Then make a request to the database server. Step three is read and write from these read from these tables. Gather up the information. Step four, send the information back to this web page. And then step five, this web page gets built with that information from the database and gets sent to you for you to see. So that's how we can read over the internet. This is just at a very high level, how we can read over the internet and how we can read and write from the database through web pages, via web pages. So this is kind of what we want to do now. So what I'm going to do is, this is a TXT file, and I have some database commands in the file that I want to submit to a database. So what I've actually done is I've created a web page, a web page with a form on it, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to issue this command. I'm going to issue the command here that says I'm going to create, let me issue this command, and then I'll put it back up. So I've issued a command that says I want to create a table. This is now an SQL statement. So this is in the language, the structured query language. This is a language that SQL engine can understand, so I can communicate with the database. And one of the things I'm doing communicating is actually creating a table. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying I want to create a table called people. I'm going to make a field called PID. It will contain an integer. It's not allowed to be null, so it can't be blank. And I want it to be an auto increment, which means it'll start with 1, and then every time I create a new person, it goes to 2 and 3 and 4. It's not a field for me to fill in. The database will fill it in. By making it a primary key, again, this is SQL stuff. That's not really part of today's lecture. But this makes it a primary key, which makes it required, it's required that it always be a unique number. It can't be a number that another user has. I have a first name which has a variable number of varying characters, 15 characters long, and it's not allowed to be null, so we don't allow people to not have a first name. We have a last name also, which is 20 characters long, and an email address which could be up to 40 characters long. So now I've created a table which currently has no people in it. Now I'm going to create another table, and let me just explain what this table is doing. This is the second table, the passwords table, just like the Excel spreadsheet I had up before. So I'm creating a table called password. I've capitalized all the words that are keywords in the SQL language, but they don't have to be capitalized. I'm making a field called people ID. It's an integer. It's not going to be null. And then I'm creating a field called password, which I'm allowing to be 10 characters. So I'm kind of putting a rule that says that the password can only be 10 characters. Okay, so, and now I have a new constraint here. This is called a foreign key constraint. You could look this up and read about it, but basically what I'm saying is that my field, people ID, is only allowed to accept values that come from the already existing table called people, and its column PID. And the reason I'm putting this constraint on it is we don't want to have passwords for people who don't exist. So only people who exist are allowed to have a password. So I'm going to submit this. And the fact that there's no error means that it was submitted correctly. So now I'm going to go to my Scratchpad, and I'm going to actually enter a person. So this is now, at this part of our talk, I'm actually focusing on SQL statements. So what I'm basically doing here is I'm saying I want to issue the command that this is now going to insert data into tables. So I'm going to say insert into the people table, and I'm going to insert into the 3 columns first, last, and email. And the data I'm going to submit is Nicole, Polizzi, and Snooki at jerseyshore.com. So that's the first name, the last name, and the email address. So I issue this command into the database, and it accepts it. And I can add, let's see, what else can I do? I can add another person if I want. By doing this. So I'm adding another person, same command, just different first name, last name, and email address. And I'm adding that person. And if I wanted to, I could say, just to make sure we're select every field from people. This is a command that's basically saying, again, this is not an SQL lecture, but I'm issuing the SQL command saying, give me all the fields from the people table, all the data from all the fields from the people table. So I issue that, and here's basically what we have. We added the name, the first name, the last name, the email, first name, last name, email. The database was generating these numbers for us, and then I was just printing out numbers, just, that we could see our data when it comes out. So now, I'm going to add passwords for these people. So I'm going to go like this. I'm going to say, I'm going to give a password to, now here's what I'm doing. I'm saying person number 1 has the password GTL, Jim Cannon Laundry. So I'm going to insert those 2 fields into our password table. And what I can also do is I can give a password to our user Mike. User number 2, which is Mike, the situation, and his password will say is abs, right? Because that's what he always talks about. So now if we wanted to list out we could list out the password table by doing this. Select all the fields from passwords. And our password table looks like this. Person ID number 1 has the password GTL. Person ID number 2 has the password abs. But we can't tell who these people are just by looking at this table. But what we can do is we could say, hey, I want to print out like all the data from the database. So we can go like this. What this is going to do is this is going to say, select every field from, and now I'm listing two tables, from the people table and the passwords table. So it's really two different tables, and I just want to take every row from every table and make every combination that there is. So this might not make a lot of sense, but here's what the output's going to look like. So the output is going to be, so what we're going to end up with is basically this. The first row, which is the first person, plus the first person's password. Then the second row of the first table, concatenated with the first row of the second table, which really doesn't make any sense. Mike's password is not GTL, that's Snooki's password. The third row is our first person plus the second password, which also doesn't make sense. And then our fourth row, which actually makes sense, is our second person with the second password. So this SQL statement, select everybody from the tables, is not actually something that makes sense to our application. The more sensible SQL statement would have been this. It would have been better if we had submitted this statement. This statement, so we're still on the SQL part of our talk today. Select every field, print out every field, from the tables, people and passwords, but I only am interested in the rows where the people ID, the people table's PID, this number, 1, is equal to the password table's people ID. So I'm only interested, see, this is a 1 and this is a 1, so I want to see this row. This is a 2 and this is a 1, so I'm not interested in this row because the second row doesn't really make any sense. This being a 1, person number 1 in conjunction with the password of person number 2 doesn't make any sense, so I don't want to see this row. But the last one, person number 2 in conjunction with person number 2's password, would make sense. So I really want to see just the first row and the fourth row because those are the only rows that actually make any sense to us. So that's what this statement is saying. It says, get me all the data, all the fields from all the tables, but I'm only interested in the rows where this condition is true, where this number equals this number. So if we submit this statement, we end up with the two rows that actually make sense. It's person number 1 in conjunction with person number 1's password, person number 2 with person number 2's password. And we actually, these numbers, the PIDs actually don't mean anything. They're just internal numbers in our database to connect the rows of different tables together. So we don't really need to see those. So what we can do is instead we can go like this. We can issue this statement. We could issue the statement, I don't want to see every field. I don't really need the PID and the people ID. Those are just internal numbers that connect our tables together. All I care about is the first name, the last name, the email, and the password. From the people and passwords tables, and I'm only interested in the rows where the people ID equals the passwords people. The people's PID equals the password table's people underscore ID field. But I don't actually want to see these numbers, is what this statement is basically saying. I only want to see first, last, email, and password. I don't want to see this column, and I don't want to see this column. So that's what this SQL statement is saying. So we're getting a good lesson in SQL and SQL across multiple tables. So now we have the first name, the last name, the email, and the password. And it's only the ones that make sense. Okay, so now what starts to become interesting is we could ask, this would actually be, if you were to create a database and you were to create a website that uses this database, here's a query that would be somewhat common to ask. What we would be saying is this. Let's say somebody goes onto your website and they decide to log in. Well, how are they going to log in? It's kind of like when you're logging into Facebook. You type in your email address, and then you type in your password, and then you hit a button. Well, what happens? Well, the email address and the password are sent somewhere. a query is going to be made against the database that's going to say, for this email, what is the password? And that's going to be brought out of the database. And it's going to then be compared to what the person just entered right now to see if the passwords match. If the passwords match, then we might say, you know, welcome, whatever your first name is, welcome Jim or whatever. And if your passwords don't match, we might want the web page to say something like, hey, passwords doesn't match, try again, something along those lines. But a very common question that a database like this is going to be asked from a web page is going to be a question where I'm going to give the database, I'm going to give you an email, and I want the database to give me the password and the person's first name. Because if the passwords match, I want to say hello Nicole, or hello Mike. So here's a question saying, give me, select the first name and the password from the people and passwords table where the people, the PID equals the PID, so we only want sensible data. And in addition to that, another condition has to be met. The email field must be equal to snooki@jerseyshore.com. We're only interested in one particular person. So what this query is asking is, for this particular email address, tell me the first name and the password. So if I submit this one, the database answers that the first name is Nicole and the password is GTL. So that's a very common question. If you're designing a database, that's a very common question that's going to be asked. Now, if the web page person has to know the details of what the tables are and what the names of the columns are and all that stuff, that's going to be very difficult for that person to learn when you create the database. And if you decide later on to change the tables, split some tables in half and put the emails in a separate email table, that this query will no longer make any sense because now there's a new table being introduced and this query will no longer work. So what we want to do almost always when dealing with web pages is after you created your tables and you start inserting data into them, if somebody is going to query the database looking for a first name and a password, we don't want them to be worried about the structure of the database. So what we'd like to do is we'd like to give them a procedure that they could call, and it would go like this. If they have an email address and they would like a password and a first name, we don't want them to have to worry about the structure of the database. We want to just give them something that says, give me the email, I'll give you the first name and the password. So what we're going to submit into our database is a procedure. And this is typically referred to as a query, but mySQL calls these procedures. So the way we do that is we use the syntax create procedure. We give it a name, make up a name. We're calling it here get first password using the email. This procedure takes something as input. So we're going to have an in field, and it's going to be the input email, and it's allowed up to 40 characters. And what does the procedure do? Well, we begin, and we basically just issue the same exact SQL statement we had before. So we select the first name and the password from the people and passwords table where these two conditions meet. So once I add this procedure to our database, it accepted it, what I'm now able to do is I'm able to go like this. I'm now able to do the following. I'm now able to say, call the syntax for the SQL statement. I can call the procedure, get first password using email. I can pass in situation@jerseyshore.com, and it will follow that SQL statement. But me, the user of this, I don't care. I don't need to know what table stuff is stored in. All I need to know is the name, get first password using email. I just need to know this name, and I need to know to give it an email address, and it will get me a first name and a password. So I can submit this now, and the answer comes back. First name is Mike, password is abs. And now I can look at the password, and if they match, I could say welcome Mike. So I now, as the user of this procedure, I do not need to know how the procedure is used. Now another very common thing, and let me just go through this on the Excel spreadsheet. Suppose we're using, this is now, what's in blue is the database that we've created in mySQL. This is just pictorially what it looks like, on an Excel spreadsheet. Suppose I wanted to create a new account. I want to add a new person. How would we have to do this? I'd have to type in the first name, the last name, and the email address, enter that into the people table, let the database generate a unique number for me. Then I'd have to take that number, whatever that is, put that number in here, and then store the password. So as I'm creating a new account, there's 4 pieces of information I need to give to create an account. The first name, the last name, the email, and the password. But I have to do it in 3 steps. First step is write first name, last name, password here. Step 2, get the generated PID. Step 3, put the generated PID here and the password here. So there's 3 steps I have to follow. So since that's going to be another very, very common thing, why don't we create a procedure for that? That didn't work. Why don't we create a procedure for that that goes like this? We'll put the procedure in here and then we'll discuss it. So we have a procedure. It's going to do 3 steps. It's going to be a procedure called create account. It's going to have 4 inputs. The inputting first, the input last, the input email, and the input password. So anybody who calls the create account procedure has to supply those 4 fields. First name, last name, email, password. So what does the procedure do? The procedure does this. We declare a piece of storage called generated PID because we know the second step is to figure out what was the PID created when we finish the first step. We now say insert into people. Under the columns first, last, and email, I'm going to insert the inputted first, the inputted last, and the inputted email. So I'm going to insert that into the first table. What this will then do is cause a row to be created in that table, and then a number to be generated. I now want to read the number that was generated, so I'm going to select the PID. I'm going to take its value and put it into the field called generated PID, which is the storage we created up here. And I'm going to get my data from people where the email equals whatever email just came in. And then I'm going to take that number, the generated PID, and I'm going to insert into the password table into the people ID field and the password field. I'm going to insert the generated PID and the input password. So what's going to happen with this procedure, let me submit this procedure into our database, so now it exists in our database. What's basically happening is this. If I wanted to create a new person, the first thing I'd do is I'd add the new person like this. I'd say, I'd type in the first name, the last name, and the email address. And I would hit enter. And then so the first step is adding the first name, the last name, and the email address. I hit enter and the database will generate a new number for us. And let's say number 2 has already been taken, so let's say it generates a number 3 for us. Now what I have to do, the next step is I have to read from the database, I have to read this number 3. And the reason I have to read this number 3 is I'm going to say person number 3 has a password of whatever that password is. So I have to read the number, and now that I know the number, I should put a 3 here, and I can type in, let's say, Jim Tan Laundry is her password also. You're allowed to, 2 different people are allowed to have the same password. So I'm now saying that Jenny's first name, last name, email is this, and her password, I take this number 3 and I look over here and 3, there's her password. So those are the 3 steps to creating an account. Step 1, you write the first name, last name, and email. Step 2, you ask the database, what is the number you generated? And then step 3, you take that number that was generated, you record it here and put the password here. So, what I can now do is I can go like this. I can create a new account by doing the following. I can say, this is not the Excel spreadsheet, this is now the real live database we just created from scratch. I'm going to say here's the first name, here's the last name, here's the email, here is the password, and it's going to do 3 steps. It's going to write the first 3 fields into the first table, which will then cause a number to be generated. It will then read the number that was generated, then take that number that was generated plus this password and store that into the passwords table. So I click this, and it's happy it took it. And now I can say, what is that command we had from before? We had this one, right? List out all our people. So if we go like this, this lists all the people in our system. So we have Snooky and Situation and JWoww. And we have their first name, their last name, their email address, and their password. Even though this is one table, and then a connection to that password is in a different table, we can, with this SQL statement, we can print out all that data. So now the question is, we've now created our database. We've done 90% of the work. We've created the database, and we've also anticipated our website. The people who are going to create our websites, they're like they're on another team. They're going to have common queries they're going to ask for the database, and they're going to have common things that they want to insert into our database. They're going to create new accounts, they're going to collect these 4 fields, and they're going to send us a message saying create this account, and we as the database have to create it. They're also going to give us an email address, and they're going to ask us what is the first name and what is the password of this user. So we can have a page. Now, I'm assuming you guys know how to create a web page with a form on it. So this is a form. A form is a part of a web page that asks questions, and then you hit a button and it takes the answers and sends them somewhere. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the code of where the answers got sent to. This would be process logins. And here's the code that's going to receive the answers that that page you just saw handled. So we're going to send the email and the password to this page. This page is going to, in this header file, we're going to have the information, the login, the password, the IP address of our database server. So we're going to take all that information. We're going to take the email and the password that was just sent to us. We're going to connect to the database server through the internet using PHP. We're going to pick the database, the collection of tables plus the database engine for those tables. And we're going to issue the command, call, get first password, get first name and password using email, and we're going to pass in the email that we got. We're going to submit this query, and then we're going to take the results and we're going to read through it, and we're going to say something like, we're going to close up connection to the database, and then we're going to say if the database password is equal to the password that the person just typed in, then we're going to send them to a page called welcome, and we're going to pass their name in. So it's going to say like welcome Mike, something like that. If the password's wrong, we'll send them right back to the login page and we'll tell them we've got a problem. The problem is the password's no good. So that's what this code is doing. And so now we can go and we could go to log in. We could go like this. We could say Snooki at and the password was this password, I'm going to log in, and it ends up saying, sends us to the hello page, I'm sorry, the welcome page, and it sends us to the, with the parameter the name equals Nicole, so we're able to print welcome Nicole. If we typed in the password wrong, let me just add a couple of X's. If the password is wrong, it clicks and it sends us right back to this page, but it has a message that says password is incorrect, try again. So what this form did was it gathered the two pieces of information, the email and the password. Now let me bring up the diagram from a while ago. Yeah, this diagram. We went to the web page, which has a form on it. The page came back to us. We answered some questions. We hit a button. The answers got sent to another page. This page connected through the internet to a database, asked a bunch of questions from the tables, and the answers came back to this page. And it compared the database, the password we typed into the password that came from this page, and if they match, it sends us to a third page that says welcome whoever you are. And if they don't match, it sends us back to this page saying you have a problem with your password. So now the other thing, another page that would be interesting would be the create account page. What do they call that? Join up, I think. Okay, so this is a page where you can join up. So very, very similar. It asks 4 questions: what's your first name, what's your last name, what's your email address, what's your password, and then you hit the join up button. It takes these 4 answers and what does it do with it? Very simple. It goes like this. It sends the 4 answers to a file called process new account, which does the following. So process new account basically takes, this is a PHP page. We include the information on how to connect to the database server. We read the first, the last, the email, and the password. We save them into local PHP variables. We connect to the database. We connect to the database server. We then connect to the database on that particular database server, the one we're interested in. And then we issue the SQL command call create account, the create account procedure. So what is the create account procedure? It's a procedure that if you give it a first name, a last name, an email, and a password, it performs the task of creating the account. And we, the person who's coding up the website, doesn't need to know what's going on in this account. The only people who need to know about that are the database people, the people who created the tables, and then created the procedure to write to those tables. They have to know those details because they're the database people. But if we are the website people, the only thing we have to know is the name of the procedure and what it needs as input. And then we just send it and they take care of it. So we submit the query into the SQL. And I hope there's one thing, I hope this isn't confusing to you. This is not a query. A query, it usually means you're asking a question, you're looking for answers. We're not giving answers, we're sending data in. There are no answers. But it's still called a query. So try not to let that confuse you. We submit the query and then we disconnect from the database and then we go right back to the joinup.php page. So actually I probably should have put some message on here like, congratulations, your account has been created. But basically, if I go to the join up page, fill in these 4 fields, hit the button, those 4 answers get sent to this file. This file gathers up the 4 answers, logs into the database, writes, takes whatever actions are needed to fill in the table, and then it's done. So what I can do is, where am I? Here's join up. So who else is on the Jersey Shore? Who else can we have join up? Now you know what? I'll use my own name. So I'll join the cast of the Jersey Shore. So I'll do this. suntan laundry. Okay, so when I hit the join up button, it's just going to come, it came right back to this page, but it took my first name, last name, email, and password, wrote the first name, last name, and email into one table, got the generated number, and then wrote the generated number and my password into the second table. So why don't I do the query where all the information gets dumped out, which was this query. So if I do this query, this is list all the fields and only the ones where the PIDs match. So we now have the 3 people from the Jersey Shore plus me. So I'm down here. So when Bill Byrne and bburn@jerseyshore.com was added to the first table, it generated the number 4. I never said I want to be person number 4. The database generated that number for me. Then that number 4 was taken, and the number 4 and my password was also added to the password database. So that's, and one last thing I wanted to cover was this is kind of a side topic, but this thing here. When we're actually connecting to the database, somehow we had to know, this database server is out there somewhere in the world, we had to know what its IP address is. So that could be, you know, www. Like let's say it was Facebook, it might be www.facebookdatabase.com, and that's the name of the machine that has the database server on it. So we have to actually know the actual name. So you might think that somewhere up top we would say, like, we'd have a variable called like $database IP address equals blah blah blah. So we actually have the variable names, database server, database user, database password, but we don't see that they're set to anything. So what I've done, instead of writing it out in every part of our website where you need to have that information, it's a good idea to put it all in one location and then have every web page that's ever going to log into the database for any reason in your website. It would be good to have it all read from the same file, because if we decide to move this database off of our workstation onto a GoDaddy server, all that information is going to change. So a sample of what it might look like, that header file, would be this one. It would look something like this. So we would basically say the database server is, you know, mySQL.monmouth.edu. The user's name is Costanza, the password is Bosco, and then the database name is, you know, Seinfeld database, something like that. Now, if we decide to later on move the database somewhere else, or change the username, or the password has to change every 30 days, or for some reason this information needs to change from time to time, it would be nice to write it in one location, and then change it in the one location, and then every file picks that up. So if that confused you, I just wanted to give an explanation for why we were doing that. So this is just, you know, like I say, this is an overview of how this database would work. So the purpose of the database is you're trying to store the data. You're as a database designer, you're trying to create tables that organizes your data as best as possible. As you start to create a more complicated combination of tables, the people who are going to use your database, which means they're going to write data into the tables and they're going to ask questions about the data in the tables, it's going to become more complicated for them to do that. But since you're the database designer, you know how the tables are laid out and how these questions should be answered, or how these queries should get that data, or the steps to storing the data into the tables. Since you know that, you should supply procedures along with your database so that users can just use the procedures and hopefully they have a meaningful name that describes the task they're doing. And that way, if you decide to change the layout of your database, you make the corresponding changes to all the procedures, and the people who use your database just need to know the names of the procedures. They just need to know where the database is on the internet, what the login is, what the password is, and the names of the procedures. They don't care how the procedures work or why they work. All they care about is that they work.